Welcome everyone to the next encounter, the Critical Theory Workshop. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Alan Schrift, who is one of the leading specialists on the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, and in particular, the French reception of Nietzsche in the post-war era, its influence on the emergence of post-structuralism. Alan published most notably Nietzsche's French Legacy, a genealogy of post-structuralism in 1995, as well as Nietzsche and the Question of Interpretation between hermeneutics and deconstruction in 1990. He's also been a very avid editor of numerous projects, including work on the question of the gift, 2 books on hermeneutics, a long 8-volume anthology on the history of continental thought, and he's currently one of the general editors for the critical edition of Nietzsche's work in English. Today we will discuss then his engagement with the relationship between the work of Nietzsche and post-war French thought, with a particular concern for the institutional framing and its reception via the concours, which is the agrégation. I'd like to start with a general question, though, concerning Alan's own intellectual itinerary and what it is over time that has led you to engage both with 19th century thought, specifically the work of Nietzsche, and then post-war French philosophy, and how your own intellectual development has led to an engagement with these 2 fronts.
Sure. Well, thanks, Gabe, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. In many respects, how I end up where I end up intellectually is due to some weird coincidences, odd encounters, with luck, perhaps. I read Nietzsche as a freshman in college and wrote my undergraduate thesis on Nietzsche, went to graduate school planning to work on Nietzsche. Began a dissertation on Nietzsche, Heidegger, and hermeneutics, which eventually ended up being my first book, Nietzsche and the Question of Interpretation. But along the way, and here's one of those contingent fortuitous encounters, my second year of graduate school, I sent a paper off to the Nietzsche Society, and it got rejected. But I was asked to comment on another paper as a consolation. That other paper was written by David Hoy. It was, this is 1980. It was on the new French readers of Nietzsche. A bunch of people who in 1980 I had never heard of. Derrida, Sarah Kaufmann, Gilles Deleuze, Bernard Moutrat, Le Boulevard, Nancy. And reading their stuff, reading what Hoy said they were doing, seemed a whole lot more interesting than what Heidegger was doing. And so what began as a dissertation on a Nietzschean theory of hermeneutics to challenge Heidegger's own position ended up a dissertation playing Heidegger's reading off Derrida's reading. And that's what led me to the French Nietzsche. And I've been pretty much working around Nietzsche since then. I'm sort of realizing partly how old I am because the sorts of questions that I got asked in my dissertation defense, I don't think people would get asked today. One of my second reader asked if I really thought my dissertation defense was 83. If I really thought in 20 years anybody would be reading Derrida. That was his sort of first question. Then he got nasty. But, and that was taken for granted that nobody was going to be reading Foucault, and he probably hadn't even heard of Deleuze. So it's the world of French philosophy and French philosophy's influence has really changed over the years. It seems to me, and as I argued in one of the pieces that you read, that Nietzsche occupies a unique place in terms of the emergence of what we call post-structuralism. over the last decade, changed my view of whether it makes any sense to talk about post-structuralism. The French find it a bizarre term. The French see nothing in common with the projects of Lyotard, Deleuze, Derrida, Irigaray, Kaufmann. But I think they actually do share some things. And one of the things that I try to argue in that paper on Nietzsche's influence is that what they share, at least the three major figures, is a significant encounter with Nietzsche early in their career, and I would say, in the case of Foucault and Deleuze, an encounter that remains singular in its influence on their entire career. I'm not sure that I would say the same about Derrida. I think after 1984, I don't see a whole lot of Nietzsche in Derrida, which is why he sort of drops out of my project a little bit. But I think, although Nietzsche is not named, he's very much in Foucault's mind in the second and third volumes of The History of Sexuality. He's very much in mind in the discussion of biopower, biopolitics, and thinking the body in general. And I think he's omnipresent in Deleuze's work, whether Deleuze is naming him or not. So Nietzsche's been my influence, or my point of engagement with contemporary French philosophy from the very beginning. What led me to the institutional stuff, which is probably the most idiosyncratic aspects of my work. Again, it is contingent events and some good luck, or I would say it's good luck. I started working in the late 90s on what I was thinking of it as a significantly large anthology of 20th century French philosophy that would bring to an Anglophone audience a number of figures that I had come to recognize were extremely influential as teachers, as mentors, and that were largely unknown even to people who worked in contemporary French philosophy. Or if they were known, they were known, I would say, to Gabe as just a name. Ferdinand Atelier is the name that Deleuze dedicates his Juillet to. And for a lot of people who work on Deleuze, that may have been all that they ever knew about him, was that he's this guy that Deleuze dedicated his first book to. So I wanted to include in this anthology figures like Jean-Paul, Marshall Garot, Cavalier, Canguilhem, Gandiac, people who influenced generation after generation of French philosophers, probably by lecturing somewhere in this building, since the vast majority of them were Sorbonne professors, and many of them professors for 3 and 4 decades at the Sorbonne. That project proved to be impossible. Impossible materially, financially. The copyrights were going to run something on the order of $65,000, and that was a non-starter for the few publishers that I even bothered to suggest this might be interesting. But before I realized that the volume was impossible, I started doing biographies, little biographies, much like the biographies that appear in the 20th Century French Philosophy book, which some of you may be familiar with. And in looking at published biographies in France, and often these were found in obituaries in the Journal of Association of Friends of the École Normale or something along those lines. French philosophical biography takes a very standard form. person's name, year they were born, year they died, where they were born, is the first sentence. Second sentence is when they passed the Congregación and what their rank was. I spent a couple of years doing biographies and looking in all sorts of places to find a biography of somebody like Emile Berthier. It's not that easy. Without question, the second sentence in the biography is what year they passed the Congregación and what their place was. I was doing this work after having written 2 books on French philosophy, thinking I knew a fair amount about French philosophy. I had never heard of the Congregación. I had no idea what it was. And I don't think most American philosophers have any idea what it is. And so I started exploring what that exam was. And as I argued in the essay from the Journal of History of Philosophy, I think that the exam is enormously influential in terms of the intellectual formation of every French philosopher prior to the decentralization of the university in 1968. And also extremely influential in terms of a certain style of French philosophy. The kind of creative exegesis that one finds in Derrida or in Deleuze. Creative, maybe even transgressive. Very close explication to text. But also challenging, I think, what is orthodoxy of how these texts are read. That's what the oral exam of the Congregación is looking for. They want you to be creative, but they never want you to leave the text. And I think, contrary to what a lot of people think about Derrida's work, especially his early work, writing different grammatology, Martin's book, he was saying things about some well-known figures that nobody ever thought to say before, but Derrida never violates the text. He may push it further than the author might have wanted it to go, but he never makes the text say something that the text doesn't say. And Deleuze does the same thing in his readings, in his reading of Hume, in his reading of Spinoza, in his reading of Kant. Those readings are, in context, incredibly innovative. But Deleuze's Hume doesn't say anything that Hume doesn't say, that Hume's texts don't in fact say. It's just Deleuze chooses to read it in a certain way. And I think that that's a function of what's required to do well in the Congregación. The other thing I'll just mention, and I'll stop, is the level at which the Congregación informs both the intellectual formation of the students who are studying for it and the whole academic world in terms of the curricula that are taught in universities, in the lycée. There's very little, it seems to me, that goes on in French philosophy through most of the 20th century. It's not directly informed by the annual reading list for the Congregación. I have to say I don't follow this stuff any longer, so I'm not sure, as I argued in my paper, that half of the courses offered at the Sorbonne are directly in response to what the syllabus is for the upcoming exam. I don't know that the Congregación is as influential as it used to be, in part because the alternative exam, the CAPES, in the undergraduate, and the CAPES program is not the same as the undergraduate program. So there are ways to avoid it, but most of the philosophers teaching at universities in Paris, I'm guessing, don't avoid it. They're all agrégés at some point or other. And as I make the case with Deleuze, virtually every one that he wrote on at the beginning of his career were on the Agrégation reading list for the 2 years that he was preparing for it. That doesn't seem to me to be either coincidental or idiosyncratic. I think if you look at what people's first books are, it's going to end up being figures that they had to prepare the Agrégation in terms of.
Maybe we can open up then for our first question about the kind of general working methodology that we deploy in order to engage with the Agrégation and its impact on French thought. Yeke, would you like to formulate some of your concerns?
So my question was, as Gabriel said, regarding methodology. What do you understand by genealogy? And if you share an understanding of genealogy that's closer to Foucault, or maybe Foucault's reading of the genealogy that Nietzsche is doing, and why genealogy is opposed to history?
Can I just jump in as well and append a question to that maybe? Because one of the things interesting in these pieces is that in engaging with people like Nietzsche and Foucault, there's a concern with giving a certain historical account that nonetheless does rely on strong reference points. You use at times the language of a real, in quotes, origin, a foundation, a starting point, which of course would resonate to someone who's read Foucault's work on Nietzsche as not being particularly genealogical. And so, in addition to the general question of genealogy, how does your own work engage with questions of origins, starting points, sources, etc.?
Well, when I think of genealogy, I think at this point, think of it more as a Foucaultian term than a Nietzschean term. And by that I mean, doing a genealogy is looking at the conditions of emergence, looking at those real, use that word, the real historical conditions out of which works emerge. And it seems to me, as a layperson would use the word real, it was a real fact up until 1968 that if one wanted to have a career as a professional philosopher in the university, one had to pass the Agrégation. I take that as a real fact in the same way that I would take as a real fact that if you want to be a living human being, you have to have oxygen. It's simply a given that one has to deal with. What I've tried to do in terms of thinking about the influence of the Agrégation is look at a couple of I don't know if I want to say concrete events, but documentable historical facts. How many journal articles are being published on a figure? How many books are being published? What's the sort of distribution rate of the publication of books? Is this just coincidence? Is this just what, when I was being taught German philosophy in graduate school, was referred to dismissively as the trendiness of French philosophy? That one year it's all about Merleau-Ponty, and the next year he's gone and it's all about Irigaray, and the next year she's gone and it's all about Gustave. And there's a kind of faddishness of French thinking, whereas the Germans are methodical and they just work through the text in the way that Germany works through things. That strikes me as just a gross misunderstanding of the concrete requirements of getting credential to teach in the French academic system. And so all of that's led me to look specifically at the agrégation because it's so unique. I mean, there are a number of unique things about the French system, especially, again, I keep talking about 68, because things change after 1968, after the Sorbonne is decentralized and the French university system is decentralized. Prior to 1968, the number of important French philosophers who didn't go to the École Normale, you could probably count on the fingers of your two hands. The number of French philosophers that had significant careers who didn't go to either Henri IV or Lycée Louis-le-Grand to do their Kanye and Ibo Kanye. You could count on the fingers of your hands. The number of French philosophers who didn't end up living and teaching in Paris. You could probably count on the fingers of your two hands. This is not like American academia. This is not like Oxbridge in the UK. This is not like anything in Germany. The centralization of the system, the fact that the system is responding to government-mandated rules, at a certain level, government-selected reading lists. I found all of this fascinating because it explained certain things to me about what I was observing in French philosophers in general. What I talk about in the essay, the omnipresence of the history of philosophy in virtually every French philosopher. For those of you that are in the United States, you know that amongst certain schools, history of philosophy isn't even philosophy. And doing history of philosophy is completely diminished as a philosophical enterprise in schools like UCLA, University of Arizona, the big analytic programs. That seems to me to be an absolutely foundational difference between philosophizing in the United States and philosophizing in France.
I wonder if I could jump in and maybe develop some of these themes and even test you a little bit, because I think that, at least in discussing your work earlier, there was a general recognition, I can't speak for everyone, but a recognition of the importance of taking into account these material practices, their inscriptions in specific institutions, and the strength of foregrounding the centrality of the agrégation, which you have done, and I don't know of other work in the Anglophone world that has done that. On the flip side, I wonder if there are limitations to privileging the agrégation. One perhaps simplistic way of reading your essays is in terms of a kind of monocausal chain of sorts, in which there's the agrégation that chooses certain proper names, publications such as Deleuze's Nietzsche publication, the emergence of French Nietzscheism, or Nietzscheanism, that then corresponds with post-structuralism and the emergence of post-structuralism. That type of chain could easily strike a reader as being very linear, monocausal, based on something like an institutional origin or something like this. Are there other factors, whether or not they be material, institutional, economic, that need to be taken into account when fleshing out the broader portrait of the emergence of what's called in the Anglophone world post-structuralism?
Sure. I've focused on the aggregation because I think it's largely been completely unrecognized. And I do think that it is significant. There are informal interventions into French philosophical instruction. I'd say to a large extent, this would explain how Heidegger gets it. And Heidegger is clearly a significant figure in the emergence of French post-structuralism, although not as significant as I think some people are inclined to view it. But Heidegger was largely taught outside the university. Beaufret gave these little seminars to interested students for 35 years. There are, I don't know, I guess I have to say institutions like the Collège International de Philosophie, like the Collège de Philosophie that Jean Ball set up, that were informal, that brought people together, that brought students, young faculty, together with more senior people, and created a certain kind of intellectual community outside the walls of the university, quite intentionally outside the walls of the university, and outside the dynamics of the aggregation and that set of influences. I think in terms of the emergence of 60s French philosophy, and here, I guess, today I'm a little bit less confident in drawing a sharp distinction between structuralism and post-structuralism. I think I may have overstated that case in some of the stuff that I wrote earlier, in part because I think I'm a function of the American academic education that I received, and I've come to rethink this by reading some, I won't say peers, but the generation younger than me in France who have a very different relationship with structuralism and don't see it as particularly antithetical to the work of Derrida or Deleuze. And if I think you look at people like Balibar or Badiou, they see structuralism and post-structuralism as much more congenial to one another, but we're not taught that. I certainly wasn't taught that. And the sort of narrative that I was very comfortable with is the narrative that says America was introduced to structuralism at the Johns Hopkins conference in '66, and much to the chagrin of the organizers, Derrida murdered structuralism right then and there, so America was introduced to a dead philosophy that Derrida deconstructed in front of Barthes and Lévi-Strauss and Lacan. And we were delivered post-structuralism, and structuralism is already passé. And I think it's still the case in the United States. I don't know many graduate programs in philosophy that teach Lévi-Strauss, for example. Whereas I've met very few French philosophers in their 30s and 40s that don't know Lévi-Strauss's work as well as they know the work of Merleau-Ponty. That's a significant cultural difference, which is not, I don't think, connected to necessarily the aggregation, but is connected to the whole cultural milieu of the French understanding of the history of their own philosophy in the 20th century.
Maybe we could turn to the way in which you frame post-structuralism in these pieces, with, of course, in mind, the fact that your own thought is changing on these issues. It's true that you highlight really 4 central figures as the what you refer to as the kind of predominant thinkers: Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard. The latter of which kind of falls out towards the end of the essay. So you have a bit of a triumvirate of 3 people who have clearly engaged directly and written on Nietzsche. So there's a number of questions that one could raise about this. Why this particular group? Why have others, whom you've already mentioned in conversation, fallen out? Sarah Kaufmann, Kristeva's brutal and radical critique of Barthes's work in the early years is often pointed to as a kind of flagship moment in a shift in discourse. The Telquel group, Philippe Soler, Luce Rigarai, and the list could go on. So why concentrate on this particular group? And then an additional question is, within that group, aren't there very significant differences between these thinkers? It's interesting that earlier you highlighted that Derrida and Deleuze were both doing work that came directly out of, methodologically, the agression. They're doing explication de texte and respectful originality. Respecting the original text, but also being original in their thinking. Someone like Foucault, as I'm sure you know, in the early 1970s, accused Derrida of being a pure product of the French intellectual system by redeploying what he called la petite pédagogie française, the little French pedagogy, meaning explication de texte. And very clearly, I think, demarcated himself from certain practices that he saw operated in someone like Derrida. His early work is often classified as being structuralist. So how do you deal with both the delimitation of that group and then within that group certain variations or even radical discords between them?
Okay, I mean, there's a lot going on in all of those questions. Why I delimit the group in the way that I do is partly a function of the extent to which they engage Nietzsche's work. And that, as I said before, it was sort of my entree into French post-structuralism is as the heirs to Nietzsche's philosophy who made it work in the second half of the 20th century. Lyotard drops out for a couple of reasons. The simple, straightforward reason is Lyotard is not that interested in Nietzsche. He played around with him a little bit in the 60s and 70s, but his interests went elsewhere. I also just don't think Lyotard is that interesting. And that's significant to thinker compared to the other 3.
What about Sarah Kaufmann? She would seem to qualify. Insofar as a direct engagement with Nietzsche, etc.
Kaufmann's work I'm trying not to be overly dismissive of it, because I like her work a lot, and although she was a difficult person, I actually liked her a lot. She has one good idea, I think, and that good idea she works through all of her writing, with a few notable exceptions, and that is bringing together Nietzsche and Freud. And reading Nietzsche from the perspective of Freud and reading Freud from the perspective of Nietzsche. And she's brilliant at that. But I'm not sure that I see much more in her work than that. I think if one, and this is going to be sort of very problematic claim, if one wants to accept a distinction between original philosophical voices and secondary source commentaries on original philosophical voices. And I do accept that distinction. And I quite happily put myself in the latter camp. Kaufmann is a commentator. I'm not sure that she has an original position in the way that you can talk about numerous original positions in Foucault, in Derrida, in Deleuze. And here I put in other people, more contemporary people, in Badu, in Rancière. I don't see it in Kaufmann's work. The others that I sort of marginalize, and this is a sort of cheap way out, but they're not philosophers. Kristeva, Irigaray, Cixous are not philosophers.
Wasn't that a classic way of denigrating Nietzsche's work for years? Right, that there's this divide between philosophers, now they're kind of literary thinkers, or whatever else you want to call them, but not properly men, and I use that term intentionally, of the concept. Don't you run that risk?
Yes.
And so what do you do with that risk? Run into it head on?
I'm not sure that I would want to put this into print, but I guess I think that it's perhaps worthwhile to draw a distinction between being a philosopher and being a theorist who has philosophical ideas, philosophical positions. And it gets back to the institutional formation of French philosophy. The reason that French philosophers pay no attention to Irigaray is not just that she's a woman. It's that she's not institutionally positioned as a philosopher. I think the same is largely true of Cixous, of Kristeva. Deleuze was very close with Kristeva, but with Cixous. They seem to like each other quite a bit.
Derrida as well.
Yeah, right, I was going to say. Unlike Deleuze, Derrida actually does engage Cixous' work a little bit.
But then you see in that Labarthe would qualify with even within those parameters as institutionally recognized as
Right.
philosophy professors.
Right. Here maybe it's just a question of taste. I do find Nancy's work interesting. And maybe there's more of a reason in Nancy's case, and again, this is sort of very autobiographical. As my career has progressed, I've become increasingly less patient with Heidegger and Heideggerians. And I find it very difficult to get anything out of Nancy that's not, to a large extent, informed by Heidegger. And I know that this is not a widely held, well, I shouldn't put it that way. A lot of people disagree with me when I claim I see very little Heidegger in Foucault and very little Heidegger in Deleuze. And that's part of why I'm more interested in Foucault and Deleuze than I am perhaps in Derrida. because there's much more Nietzsche there and much less Heidegger. But that's why I can't follow particularly Nancy's work. So it's just a personal choice on my part as to why I don't include him and do include the people that I include.
We run the risk, and this is more of a comment than a question, of somewhat personalizing the history, which might create some problems, as well as giving a lot of weight to the institution per se, as that which credentializes truly philosophic thought. But I know that there were some other people who also had some questions around just coming back to the core issue, how you frame post-structuralism and understand it. Does anyone want to jump in on this? Sean, is that a yes?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was curious if you think any of these I was curious if you think any of these three thinkers in particular, if their readings of Nietzsche might in some way be incompatible with each other, if at all, and also if you think that there is a need to sort of turn to Nietzsche at this particular time. You mentioned deliberate anti-Hegelianism, but if in fact you think that versus, let's say, a Marxist critique of Hegel, if there might be some need to turn to Nietzsche on the part of these three thinkers as a way of also coming Hegel.
Again, here, I guess, I want to separate Derrida from the other two. I think what Derrida finds in Nietzsche is not necessarily what Deleuze and Foucault find in Nietzsche. And I think what we find in Derrida, to a large extent, after the postcard, is not, to me, obviously informed by his interpretation of Nietzsche or what he sees of significance in Nietzsche. I don't see a whole lot in Deleuze and Foucault and their use of Nietzsche that's incompatible. I think that they draw on theory of forces. I think they draw on an attention to affirmation, an attention to difference and differentiation. They do different things with it. And ultimately their respective projects go separate ways. But I think that they offer complementary readings of Nietzsche, which each of them takes in their own direction. For Foucault, Nietzsche is the anti-Kant. And in Foucault's early work, at least, and here I'm thinking of The Order of Things and the introduction to Kant's anthropology. In Foucault's epistemic theory of discontinuities, Kant is the end of the previous moment, and Nietzsche is the emergence of the modern. And Nietzsche is absolutely critical there, and absolutely critical as the counter to Kant. Deleuze doesn't seem to be particularly concerned with Nietzsche's relationship with Kant. To me, Deleuze is largely motivated by bringing Nietzsche together with Spinoza. And seeing the two of them as the two affirmative philosophers arguing for a philosophy of affirmation. And that's explicitly anti-Hegelian.
Could I just ask a quick follow-up? Would you say that what Foucault is doing is compatible, again, for lack of a better word, with a Nietzschean concept of forgetting, or the need to forget, given the genealogy and the archaeology kind of characteristics? Is there or that could this be a serious difference between the Deleuzian and Foucauldian approaches?
For Nietzsche, forgetting is ideally mobilized very self-consciously. And I don't see that as incompatible with Foucault's project in the archaeology. I think one of the reasons why Foucault is disparaged by historians is to a large extent that historians find him ignoring certain historical facts that complicate his picture. And I think Foucault's answer to that would be the historical story I'm telling requires that we forget those facts. That these are the facts that I want to isolate so as to set up my account of what the archive is, what the episteme is at this particular moment. And so I think Foucault would do his histories in the same way that Nietzsche does his. And here, I guess, I'm not, you could probably make the same argument with the language of repression or suppression. You're right that Nietzsche makes the argument in terms of active forgetting. I think Foucault would be comfortable with that.
Transitioning to then one of the central themes in your analysis of post-structuralism is the status of subjectivity. And so I'll turn the floor over for a question about it.
I'm going to talk about three moments in the French philosophy. First, about structuralism understanding.
Please just talk loud.
Three moments in the French philosophy in terms of conception of subjectivity. I mean, to make a rough generalization, maybe we can work with it. So first, structuralism is the split of the subject, depth of the subject.
Okay.
So subject is more or less through the function of the structures. And then there is post-structuralism, post-structuralist critique of that understanding of subject, which historicizes the subject at the same time. Gives sort of potential on the part of the subject to act on the structures. As you say in the book, it's more or less subject is both constituted, unconstituted, so they have a complex understanding of subjectivity. And there is this third moment in the 90s. So there is anti-Nietzscheans in the French academia, they call for a return or recourse to sort of autonomous subjectivity. And they seriously criticize the post-structuralist understanding of subject, and they have a kind of, I think, superficial reduction of the post-structuralist understanding. And then maybe we can add also Badiou and Zizek, they also call for a return to subjectivity in their own peculiar way. So we have this big picture in general. So, I mean, you wrote that book on 95, right? In 95, and it's been 20 years, and there are lots of discussions going on about what comes up with the subject. Is the subject there, or is it? Maybe I can jump on another level of the question, and of course, the differentiation between man and the subject. So, post-structuralism, they don't declare the depth of the subject, but a certain conception of the subjectivity is out of date. So the man is there, but the subject is survives on another intellectual level. So, I mean, how do you position yourself in the contemporary discussions of subjectivity? And do you still think that is it useful to, or is it useful to think in terms of Nietzsche's understanding of subjectivity and post-structuralist complex way of understanding subjectivity? Can you still use it, or is it out of date, or whatever?
Well, I guess in the sort of three moments that you talk about, I'm not particularly interested in the anti-Nietzschean moment of Gabriel Rockhill. I think there's a long history in French philosophy of the next generation brutalizing the preceding generation to make a little space for themselves. Sartre and Merleau-Ponty did it to Bergson, Althusser did it to Sartre, Deleuze and Foucault may have done it to their teachers. I think Ferry, all of the people in the Why We Are Not Nietzscheans book, there's more edible drama at work in that book than there is good philosophizing. If there is a philosophical moment in that book, it's a return to Kant, and I'm not interested in a return to Kant's autonomous subject. And if I were going to be interested, I'd probably look to Habermas or Hammett and not to Ferry or Renaud or Bacon. Regarding the other two moments, I guess I see more resources in the post-structuralist notion of the subject. And here I think the place to go would be Foucault. Foucault is always, I think, in his work, thinking about the subject. And I think that in the period of 75, 76, Discipline and Punish, and the first volume of the History of Sexuality, it would be fair to say that he was looking at the subject as, to a large extent, the construction of certain institutional practices. And I would suggest that the guiding thought in that project is Foucault's understanding of the genealogy of morality in Nietzsche, and the construction, the argument in the first two essays that the notion of interiority, of internal subjectivity, is a motivated construction for the purpose of controlling individuals through guilt and bad conscience. I think that that's the argument of the first and second essays. It fits what Nietzsche refers to elsewhere as the hangman's metaphysics of Christianity. Interiority is not created in order to allow for individuality or creativity. Interiority is created in order to institute modes of control through primarily guilt. I think to a large extent that's how Foucault understands the practices of discipline motivated toward the construction of docile bodies, how he understands the working of the exam in order to create subject types that then are held to a certain form of behavior. The sort of argument that he makes in the first volume of The History of Sexuality, that at a certain point we don't have agents engaging in acts of sodomy, but instead we have the sodomite, who is an entire fixed personality with a documentable ideology and certain procedures for cure. Between 76 and 84, Foucault seems to be engaged in a different project. And whether that's hermeneutics of the self, whether it's the care of the self, the subject that's the process of subjectivation that he's talking about in the second and third volumes of The History of Sexuality and the lectures in the last couple of years is not simply a product of institutional forces. I don't think Foucault's got the full account of what it is that's caring for the self when the subject is told to care for itself. I think that there are perhaps metaphysical issues that are not resolved. But there's some self-direction in the process of care of the self that I'm not sure is in discipline for the account of the subject in the first volume of The History of Sexuality. So as to where one would go, I'd like to see more work allowing for some self-direction in the process of navigating and negotiating the institutional forces that are clearly at work all around us. In a funny way, what I'm thinking of here is a line of Sartre's from Search for Method, where he talks about the vulgar Marxist understanding of human beings as completely being determined by economic conditions. And Sartre says something like, yes, Paul Valéry is clearly a product of the material conditions in which he lived, but not everyone who lived in those material conditions turned out to be Paul Galilei. That's what vulgar Marxism can't account for. And I think that that's still the question that the legacy of post-structuralism has to account for.
Can you maybe relate this back to the very status of Nietzsche or other proper names for that matter? We've spoken of a number of proper names. What you seem to be suggesting is that then the more forceful conception of subjectivization that you're interested in is the way in which subjects are not always already there, but are instead constituted out of material practices, institutions that construct something like a doer behind a deed, to use slightly Nietzschean vocabulary. If we take that modality of thinking about subjectivity and then relate it reflexively to the way in which we engage with certain thinkers and identify them as kind of subject points, such as Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, or others that we've been talking about, wouldn't one then almost need to call into question the unicity of that subject point and recognize the extent to which it's actually a institutional, social, material construction, and that there might not actually be a doer behind the deed or any kind of unified source point of individual thinking behind a set of material productions, texts, and then their institutional inscription. You see what I mean? Just trying to move from the level of theorization about subjectivization and the constitution of subjects to that of the very functioning of these unified proper names as they would function, for instance, in historical narrative.
Well, I guess I'm not, I mean, I think I agree with you. And I think the way I would put it is that I'm not sure that I see those names being isolatable and unified subjects.
Right.
Proper names function as the naming of an event. Nietzsche is an event. There's the event of the Nietzsche who was born in 1844, went mad in 1889, died in 1900. But there's also the event of Nietzsche, the author of these books, that has been through numerous interpretations and reinterpretations. And the proper name is just an abbreviation for the totality of the various dimensions of that event, which, in that sense, also speaks to the fact that Nietzsche is not dead. He's alive in the way that there was a new Nietzsche created by French philosophy in the 60s and 70s. And that was a new Nietzsche, and that was 7 years after he was dead. But suddenly, all his texts became new. So my use of these proper names is a matter of convenience. The problem, as I see it, in terms of a theory of subjectivity, is accounting for the space of self-directedness in the process of the institutional and material formation of persons. I'm not sure I mean, it may be that it's a problem of language in the way that Nietzsche says we can't get rid of God until we get rid of grammar. Our grammar leads us metaphysically to think of fixed subjects, substantial subjects. Nietzsche is to me still interesting because if I assume, and I do, that he's not just completely inconsistent and is saying whatever it is he thinks at the moment that he thinks it, he fairly consistently denies any notion of a fixed, enduring subject. And whether it's called the subject, whether it's called the self, whether it's called the soul, he's pretty consistent in denying that. He's also pretty consistent in affirming the process of self-overcoming. And self-overcoming as an ongoing process. Two obvious sort of conceptual problems. What is that self that's engaged in overcoming itself if there is no self? And putting it in a little bit different language, if whatever is will to power, what is do we have to ask what is doing the willing and the willing to power? Does there have to be a subject willing to power? I think that's the same question that Foucault is struggling with in terms of the care of the self. Who is the agent that's caring for the self and engaged in the construction of a self to be cared for, if it isn't already there, but is in the process of being made? I don't have answers to this, but where I would be inclined to go is Deleuze's language of becoming and difference underlying even momentary notions of identity. That language works, but I'm not sure how much further I can go. So I was hoping that Deleuze's students would go somewhere further. It's not going to be, well, I'm pretty sure it's not going to be Badiou who's going to be taking me where I want to go, because it all can't be about being able to understand infinity.
Yeah, based on what you said, I don't think it will be. But actually, with an eye to more kind of contemporary philosophical developments, one of the concerns that came out of our earlier discussion was the ways in which your methodology for analyzing the institutional apparatus and how it segues with philosophical thought, the ways in which this methodology could be used to look at the current historical conjuncture. So I'm checking this one.
I was very much interested in that institutional focus, that you looked at the institutional procedures and the transformations of these procedures and their effects on French philosophy. And considering that, as well as the fact that you have expressed concern about marketization of higher education. For instance, one instance that I came across was in New York Times, a letter by you published there. You said, unfortunately, measuring higher education itself in terms of market values has now become the norm, and the norm of the public and private universities and colleges. So considering these two, I was actually wondering if you can talk a little bit about this connection, if the current marketization and the institutional transformations that are usually called as neoliberal today, for instance, the Bologna process in Europe, the standardization here, or privatization of universities, those institutional transformations in higher education, do you think there is a significant effect on the contemporary French and, if you will, actually American philosophy?
Yes. I think it seems to me that the dynamic that's driving higher education in America is a little bit different than the dynamic that is driving higher education in France. This is going to perhaps be wildly off the mark because my knowledge of contemporary French economics is not very deep. It seems to me that French higher education is falling apart. Literally, buildings are falling apart. There's no money to pay faculty salaries. Departments are getting smaller. Students are learning English and going to get jobs in the UK, in Amsterdam, in the United States, because there are no jobs for them here. Again, these may be just semiotic indicators that don't mean anything, but I find it distressing when I go into the Quinn bookstore and see the gigantic room devoted to analytic and Anglo-American philosophy that used to be where I bought all my used copies of Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Beauvoir and Derrida and Deleuze, when that was the big bookstore to buy used philosophy books. When I look at the new books on philosophy, if you take out Deleuze and Foucault, there's not a whole lot there on that table of new stuff. Again, there may be other factors at work, but Gilbert Joseph, the philosophy floor has moved from the second to the third. I don't think it's ascending to heaven. I think it's ascending to where they assume people don't want to walk that far down after they feel the books. It's approaching the irrelevant. There is an argument that's a little bit less purely financial that my letter to the editor that you referred to was talking about in the United States. And there, I think, France has been moving in that same direction probably longer than the United States. I mean, it's not been that long since it was possible to take the back without a philosophy class. When those first proposals were coming up in France, I found it interesting both that the person pushing those proposals was a philosopher, Luc Ferry, and the strongest resistance to those proposals were coming from the scientists, who were claiming that their having had to pass the classe de philo to get the bac made them better scientists than their peers in the United States or other places where you could completely eliminate the humanities and certainly philosophy from your education. But they lost. The scientists lost, the philosopher won. So now not every bac recipient has to take philosophy. In the United States, the problem is much broader than just philosophy. Humanities programs are having to justify themselves in terms of their students being able to get jobs. And this may seem very naive, and perhaps the underlying sentiment of that letter to the editor was naive, but is the only purpose of education to get a job? And is that the only criterion according to which we judge whether getting an education is worthwhile? Socrates is not a big fan of mine, but there is something about education leading to good life that I think has, for a long time, animated the liberal arts. And the humanities at the center of the liberal arts. One doesn't find that argument being made very often these days. And rarely does one find that argument being made by anyone who doesn't have a very direct vested interest in the liberal arts, like me as a professor of philosophy. I don't know who the Minister of Education is in France right now, and I don't know what his or her position is. But in the United States, I find it distressing that no figure in higher education is making an argument for the value of education as being intrinsic rather than purely instrumental toward earning more money. And so that was sort of, again, what motivated that letter. And I don't know if that entirely...
Yeah, definitely. And this is actually a very, very interesting topic that I would like to hear more about if there are any other immediate question about institutional change, but about the relationship between education and good life, and maybe like more political citizen education, and how one of the major things that we have been talking about in this series of seminars were the relationship between democracy and citizen education and education. So I would be also pleased to hear more about that.
Well, it's it seems to me to be a very big problem in the United States that not only is education increasingly not valued, even amongst the educated, to a certain extent. What's valued is income potential. But this sort of bizarre, and it's ironic that a sort of Nietzschean who denies truth would be troubled by the fact that there's this bizarre denial of fact at work in American politics and political discussion. That's producing, I think, disastrous political decisions. And that I find it very hard to imagine changing in any positive way in the near future. I'm not sure what it's going to take to get the United States population to take global warming seriously. It seems as if democracy depends upon an educated population. And if we're not going to have the resources available to educate the population, then I'm not sure what's going to happen with democracy. There are moments where I'm not at all sure that the United States is a democracy anymore. By Plato's taxonomy of politics, we sure look more like an oligarchy than we do like a democracy. And we're looking increasingly like an oligarchy with each new decision of the Supreme Court.
Pseudo-cratic oligarchy, perhaps? Thinking of the Supreme Court decisions. Oh, you were thinking perhaps of others. There have been many.
Yeah.
I was thinking of McCutcheon and the
Right.
continuation of Citizens United.
Right. That's sort of going off a little bit on my own paranoias about the future of the United States democracy from your question. There's something odd to me about the fact that an argument has to be made for the value, the intrinsic value of education. I'm not sure when in previous history, Western history, since Plato and Aristotle, that one had to make an argument that being educated is better than not being educated. With perhaps, it's going to be a long period, the period in which all value is determined by Vatican and the Church. And in those cases, education deferred to faith very explicitly.
Would it be important to contextualize this and talk about the economics behind it? Because education is, to just say is education valuable or not, I don't think it's centered on its own, because I don't think education is always a choice. At least, especially we talk about America and we're taking into consideration the prices, we even talk about what's considered like a third world country. So if it's not a matter of choice every time, in terms of like, do you have access actually, are you able to go to college and afford it and all this, then I think it's like the question of just simply, is it worth it or not? Right, so do we actually have to talk about a bigger problem about economics to then come back and address this question of the worth of education?
I guess it's perhaps the issue that has to be addressed is what are the material dimensions in terms of which we should evaluate the value of education. I think I want to be as materialist as possible. And so the conditions that are going to have to be taken into account are going to be material conditions. But it seems as if the relevant material condition that's governing the discourse of educational policy is the potential to maximize your income. And I think that there can be other material justifications for education. Even if we look at the so-called third world. Maybe it's just a semantic distinction, but it seems to me that people who valued education and saw education as a way to escape their current conditions and improve their life were thinking about improving their life in terms other than how much money they would make. Whereas I'm not sure in the United States these days that there's much of a value being used to judge the worth of educational institutions beyond the potential to generate income. Maybe it's implied that more income means you'll have a better life. But I'd like to see that at least said explicitly every now and again.
Danny, you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Or Stefan?
No, I mean, I certainly share a lot of those values, I think probably all of those values, but it becomes difficult if you draw it that way, right? Because, I mean, there's a lot of determining causal factors, but you can't say it's not unrelated that this recent emphasis on education for the sake of seeking employment, for the sake of maximizing profit, that's not totally separate from the fact that historically in America, it coincides with the development of more avenues and a broadening out of the social economic spectrum that has availability to education itself. I mean, there's a risk of seeming nostalgic for this great era when, you know, only those from the richest families went to school. That's all I worry about was becoming great middle waters.
Well, perhaps I'm a product of, I mean, my thinking here is a product of the educational choices that I've made. Because anyone who chooses to study philosophy and become a philosophy professor clearly has aspirations for their education other than income. And anybody who's smart enough to actually get a PhD and get a job in philosophy sure could have used that intelligence to make a hell of a lot more money in some other field and perhaps retire at the age of 25 or 30 and then live the good life with all of the income that they had made off their intelligence. So the fact that there are philosophers seems to be a counterexample, a very concrete counterexample to the idea that education has to be tied to material success in that crude sense of income.
That's not necessarily the argument that you were making, right? You're suggesting that educational opportunities can also reconfigure the socioeconomic framework in certain ways and produce perhaps limited but nonetheless existing modes of equality. I mean, that's what I heard.
Perhaps. I mean, I was making more of an argument of the difficulty of historically understanding the situation and moving from that to a better situation in which we can have at the same time an educational institution open to a total array of economic classes, social classes, races, etc., genders, and at the same time have these discourses that are just knowledge for the sake of knowledge in itself, or education in itself. So what I was saying was that, you know, if you look from, even take, whether you want to see it as a long view or a short view, look at 1900 in education in America versus today, tremendously larger proportion of the population who can have access to education, higher education, let's say. Tremendously proliferated number and variety and kind of colleges, many more public colleges, many more affordable colleges, many more government programs and independent programs that are available to give lesser opportunity to people. What I was saying is that the problem at the heart of these conflicting values that we probably share, that those things are related. That because it's a much wider class of people that have the opportunities, that wider class of people has necessarily economic, financial, selfish concerns. I mean selfish in a really non-judgmental way. It's simply the way that life has to work for philosophy is a very small discipline, demographically speaking, and a remarkably non-diverse one.
I think there are a couple other people who wanted to jump in, and we'll have to, I know the heat is quite soporific, so we'll probably have to wrap up soon, but Brian and Stefan, did you want to speak directly?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. That's what I understood you saying, almost like a Rockhillian kind of argument about education. But I mean, a counterexample would be is that this sort of like, is that opening up education to wider, to previously excluded classes, this sort of individualistic, vocationalist emphasis, I don't think is a necessary consequence. One partial counterexample might be in Germany, where it's still, Germany has its own set of issues with its educational system, but there a PhD in the humanities is still valued, even vocationally. It's symbolized differently. Even if you take something like, major in, you get a doctorate in literature, and that has nothing to do with the job you're interviewing for. They take it as a sign that you are a self-starter, that you're committed to finishing a project, to working independently, to thinking originally. And these things are valued and so in that sense, there's still a more, that's one way in which, the more the humanities still are seen to have value in the German society and even in German career. So that's just like an example of complicated, is that there's sort of more than one, is that what you see happening in the United States is not a necessary consequence. And it's one possibility, but I think it has, my own conjecture is I think it has a lot to do with something much more valued in, much more in the way U.S. imagines itself as a society. And in an important way, it kind of doesn't, at least not the way you see it in Europe. If you go back to the French philosophers like Foucault, especially, or in German critical theory like Horkheimer and Habermas and so forth, they have a much more, or Arendt, they have a much more sensitive to this idea of the social. And I think part of it might be because they're much more in touch with cultures that have an idea of society, which is something that has traditionally been very, very heavily put down in American political culture. As one of the reasons, for example, like in American political culture, you've never seen much of a far left, like the communist movement. You've never seen much of a far right in terms of a fascist movement either. It's sort of in this middle, kind of very hard, like individualistic idea. And so these are just a few thoughts.
Stefan, do you want to jump in the conversation? Then we'll give Alan a bit of a chance.
I was going to ask earlier, I see this sort of causal link between the ballooning cost of tuition, and then at the same time a really concerted effort by the right in the United States to undermine public institutions and education, both in a way closing opportunities for a lot of people, and then also this more, and then the disparaging of the humanities in popular culture and how we see it in the newspaper and how people in conversation and so on, and within the university itself. And then at the same time, to make a broader point, another causal link to maybe the lack of engagement with our political system. And then I'm not saying just because people aren't engaged in humanities, that's the problem with our democracy in the US, but maybe drawing this connection
I'm not sure what to say about the ballooning cost of education. I think that there might be ways to control those costs in just the same way that people talk about the ballooning cost of healthcare, and there are clearly very simple ways to control those ballooning costs. And all we have to do is look at any health policy in Europe and you'll see how to control those ballooning costs, but somehow those options seem to be not on the table in the United States, even to the point of any serious conversation about them. I think the thing that you said, which I've come increasingly to be sensitive to, is that there really is an absence of any notion of community in the United States, any notion of a shared public space. And that has come to dominate politics in the last 30 or 40 years. And one of the consequences of that is the increasing sense that there's something immoral about being taxed. And paying taxes is sort of a fundamental violation of one's human rights. And this has kind of been, in a mild form, it's bizarre that I'm going to talk about the Reagan Revolution as a mild form, but it started with Reagan, and it's now manifesting itself in a certain Tea Party mentality, which is becoming increasingly stronger. And the first clear consequence of this, I think, that we're seeing is the collapse of public education in the United States at all levels. If any of you are TAs at state universities, you know how pathetic the entering freshmen are in terms of their basic reading and writing skills. And these are the smart ones that graduated from high school and got into college. I teach at a very wealthy and privileged undergraduate liberal arts college.
Taught? No.
I'm still on the
Okay.
Right now I'm on
Fully
staff.
emeritus.
Right. No, I'm still a member of the faculty.
Okay.
We have enough money to basically allow people of any income to go to the markets. Our president is continually telling the faculty that we have to prepare for the new normal, which is the vast majority of kids who graduate from a public high school have come to college unprepared to do college work. And he sort of laid it out this way, and it's crude, but he's black, so he can be crude. We've got a choice. We can either keep our current standards and enroll an entering class that is 95% white and wealthy. Or we can deal with what are going to be high school graduates of the future, which means much of the freshman year is going to be remedial education. Remedial math, remedial writing, remedial reading. And he's not saying we can't teach introduction to philosophy, but introduction to philosophy will be taught as de facto a writing composition class. Do you understand what Socrates says when he talks about piety here. Do you know what the word pious means? Can you write a grammatically correct sentence describing Socrates' position? This is what he's telling us is going to be the future. And this is at an elite liberal arts college, one of the top 25 in the country. I shudder to think what it's going to be like teaching intro to philosophy at the University of Arkansas or the University of Tennessee. That is all a function, it seems to me, of the fact that the American population, to a large extent, is unwilling to fund public education. And it's a very concrete and conscious choice. Is Europe there yet? I don't know. What I hear about France is that there are some high schools that are terrific, and there are some high schools that the teachers are pretty much committed to keeping the homicide rate as low as it can be and not doing much else with teaching their students. And the difference between those high schools is going to be what arrondissement or what bond you live in. I don't know if the dynamic is the same. What's leading to the problems in France as what's leading to the problems in the United States. And I don't know whether the problems in France are uniform throughout the EU. But I think it has to do with a kind of consciousness and ideology, as well as a kind of attention to real material relations.
These are very big issues. There's a lot on the table, much more to discuss, but I propose that we wrap up here and then continue the discussion informally. So thank you very much, Alan, for coming.